my name is Krish and this is my co-writer
Gautam Krishnaswamy.
and today we are sharing the tea on Defiant Compliance. Somewhere in Kentucky, a law was passed that said that all schools in every single classroom need to have the national motto, which is, "In God we trust." Now, to comply with this law, guess what the schools did? They put up a dollar bill. Now technically, this does have "In God we trust" written on it, and it fits within the letter of the law. So technically, this was compliance. But this did not follow the spirit of the law. So when you read into it, it is obvious that this is defiance. Talking about this today, we are going to go through a few examples. We are going to look at Shostakovich, the Orange Alternative, Trump and Leningrad, and the Goa Art Festival. First, let's talk about Scott. Scott said that there is such a thing as malicious compliance. This means that when peasants did not want to work, they still did the work, but they were dragging their feet and working slower. This, he said, was a form of defiance. Then, there is Mumby, who talks about a symbolic protest, but he says that it is useless. This is something that people after him disagree with a lot. Bourdieu says that power is symbolic and cultural. And then Butler says that the performing of resistance itself is resistance. Finally, we want to talk about what Ismatu Gwendolyn says, and they say that art making is world making. That will come in later. So you have two options. First is that you publicly protest, you list everything, and then you are at the mercy of the state. Or your second option is you stay silent and you survey yourself. To see this in real life, let's start with the first example.
So, what precisely is resistance when resistance cannot speak in the register of open refusal? And what in turn is compliance when compliance itself becomes the medium through which critique is smuggled, staged and sustained? To ask those questions is to move beyond the binary that so often structures accounts of authoritarian culture. On one side, overt dissent, on the other, passive submission. Shostakovich, in our work, is valuable precisely because he unsettles that binary. His work compels us to think instead about what James C. Scott would call the space between public transcript and the hidden transcript, that zone in which domination is acknowledged publicly but contested obliquely, often through coded forms, irony, parody and strategic ambiguity. Under Stalin, culture was not merely regulated, it was politically disciplined through symbolic force. Socialist realism functioned as a regime of aesthetic legibility, demanding that art produce optimism, clarity and ideological resolution. Where normally you would have art for art's sake, where art is simply created to express ideas, you now have art for the state's sake. Art is solely created to propagate any sort of idea of the ruling regime. And so, this led to the creation of socialist realism. Pierre Bourdieu's account of symbolic power is useful here. Power operates not only through coercion, but through the regulation of perception, classification and cultural legitimacy. In such a field, the state does not simply punish deviance after the fact. It determines in advance what counts as art, and what counts as seriousness, what counts as historical truth, and what forms of expression are admissible as national culture. The Soviet aesthetic order therefore sought to monopolize not only institutions, but the very grammar of ineligibility. When you look at this art piece, that is Roses for Stalin, could you say that perhaps this is presenting an idealized notion of the youth and the children loving Stalin, and it portrays him in a good light?
Yeah, in a fatherly light.
Yeah. So this painting is called Chicken in the Suburbs by Oscar Rubin. And so when he was asked about this painting and to describe it, he said that this martyred chicken, like all ready-to-eat poultry, got me into a lot of trouble. The authorities saw it as slander of Soviet reality. Now, Shostakovich's career must be understood against this backdrop of symbolic discipline. The condemnation of his play, for instance, Lady Macbeth and the Metets district in Pravda in 1935 was not just a review. It was an act of discursive power. The famous editorial, muddled instead of music, signaled that the formal deviation could be converted into political illegibility, and that illegibility could then be converted into danger. The death of Meyerhold, one of Shostakovich's closest associates, extended that lesson into the realm of embodied practice. The state could not only name dissent, but destroy the artist who made it visible. The work can be legible as public affirmation and also as private mockery, as patriotic tribute, but also as tonal sabotage. That doubleness is not a flaw that arises when you interpret the work. That is, actually, the condition of the music's political force. This is where Judith Butler's notion of performativity also becomes illuminating. For instance, Butler, power is not reproduced not simply by what is said, but by repeated acts that cite and stabilize norms. Yet, repetition also creates the possibility of slippage, parody, and resignification. The Seventh Symphony is especially instructive. Officially, it belonged to the wartime public transcript. It's anti-fascist, patriotic, collective.
Моя седьмая симфония навеяна грозными событиями 1941 года. Нашей борьбе с фашизмом, нашей грядущей победе над врагом, моему родному городу Ленинграду я посвящаю это сочинение.
But the famous invasion theme is musically fascinating because it is banal before it is terrifying. It is outwardly an acceptable public object, a symphonic reaffirmation of Soviet resistance to its external invasion by the Nazis. Yet, its tonal instability, its grotesque accumulation, and its uneasy affect invite listeners to hear something more. Not only the fascist enemy outside the state, but the broader structure of terror through which states reproduce themselves. The Ninth Symphony sharpens this argument. The Seventh is a double-voiced wartime utterance. The Ninth is an anti-monumental refusal of state expectation. After victory in 1945, the official script, the Soviet authorities, demanded of Shostakovich a grand celebratory symphony in the tradition of Beethoven's Ninth, choral, triumphant, historical, and glorifying. Shostakovich instead produced a compact, ironic, and often mischievous work that withholds monumental closure. This is why Shostakovich is so important. He shows us that the hidden transcript need not always appear as an underground manifesto or an explicit counterpublic. It can live in the sanctioned symphony of the state. It shows how symbolic power can be both endured and redirected, how performativity can become a site of slippage, and how double-voiced discourse can carry critique without abandoning legality. The next case study is regarding the Orange Alternative in Poland. In the 1980s in Poland, opposition to state socialism did not speak only in the language of strikes, petitions, or underground newspapers. It also spoke in wars. And that, I think, is precisely what makes the Orange Alternative so conceptually important. Under General Jaruzelski's authoritarian regime, and in the lingering shadow of martial law, a loose network of students and artists in rock law began staging happenings that looked less like protests and more like absurd children's parties. People in orange hats, cardboard costumes, painted faces, handing out toilet paper, chanting nonsense slogans, and drawing tiny gnomes on city walls. But the point was never simply to be funny. The point was to turn the regime's own public script against itself. James C. Scott gives us a way of naming this. His distinction between the public transcript and the hidden transcript helps us see that domination is never complete, because people always develop a backstage language in which power is mocked, narrated, and undermined. The Orange Alternative, though, does something slightly different. It does not stay entirely backstage. It drags the hidden transcript into the street, but disguises it as play. It brings critique into public stage under the mask of harmlessness. And that is why it was so hard for the state to contain. Because how do you arrest a dwarf? How do you ban a joke without admitting that the joke has already exposed you? To understand why this kind of politics made sense in Poland in the first place, we have to step back. In the interwar period, in the 20s and 30s, between the First and Second World Wars, Poland was a newly reconstituted state, politically fragile, economically unstable, and surrounded by the pressure of authoritarianism on all sides. In that context, writers like Bruno Schulz turned to grotesque humor and dream logic, and deliberately unreal settings as a way of telling the truth about a world that already felt unreal. Their work, shaped by Dada, surrealism, expressionism, suggested a very important idea that when reality becomes incoherent, exaggeration sometimes is more honest than realism. And then there is Bakhtin. Bakhtin's idea of carnival helps us understand why these happenings were so effective. Carnival is not a revolution in the strict sense. It does not abolish hierarchy permanently, but it does suspend hierarchy, invert it and mock it, and reveal its fragility through laughter, excess and bodily performance. That is exactly what the Orange Alternative did. Take the Dwarf Revolution in 1988. On paper, it was a children's celebration. In reality, thousands of people flooded the streets of Wroclaw wearing orange dwarf hats, elf ears and improvised costumes, chanting slogans that sounded nonsensical but carried an unmistakable political charge. The Orange Alternative understood that authoritarian power depends on seriousness. It needs the street to be legible. It needs dissent to look like dissent, so the movement refused that legibility. It became unpoliceable by looking ridiculous. Because if the militia intervened, they looked absurd. If they did not intervene, they looked weak. If they arrested people dressed as dwarves, they made themselves look like bureaucrats terrified of nonsense. But if they tolerated the action, they became part of the joke. That is defiant compliance at its sharpest. The state is forced to choose between two equally horrifying humiliations. The Orange Alternative did not break the script by tearing it up. It broke the script by performing it with a grin. And maybe that is the larger point of defiant compliance. It is not passive obedience, and it is not heroic rupture. It is a practice of strategic over-identification, where the subject survives by acting within the regime's own symbolic grammar, while quietly turning that grammar against itself.
Now let's move on to our next case study, which is Les Miserables and Trump. Imagine a room of complete opulence, where all the walls are gilded with gold. And sitting there are people who have immense power in the whole world. Then the doors open and in walks the military. They have precise coordination and they are the very definition of compliance. What do you think they sing? This is a military choir singing. Do you hear the people sing from Les Miserables?
One more
the 2025 Governor's Ball, and that was the Army Choir singing Do You Hear the People Sing, which is a song by the revolutionaries who are singing for justice. When this was posted on a lot of social media platforms, it was accompanied by comments saying things like, "This wasn't for the crowd, it was for the rest of us," or "Absolutely powerful, but the message has gone entirely over the guests' privileged heads. I applaud this beautiful act of resistance." And finally someone said, "They're going to be so mad tomorrow when they learn what happened." So looking at this, we can understand that this presentation was actually a Trojan horse, which used the regime's spectacle itself and turned the table against it.
So, imagine you're walking into a gleaming government-backed arts festival by the sea. The banners promise creativity, diversity, and experimentation. Ministers and senior bureaucrats have cut the ribbon. Heritage buildings are lit up. Riverfront promenades are dotted with installations and thousands of people, families, students, tourists and all wander between the galleries and performance spaces, all under the reassuring stamp of government approval. Now, place this scene in December 2019. Outside the bubble of this festival at the national stage, India is convulsed by protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the proposed National Register of Citizens. The curatorial premise was framed in the language of real conditions and social needs, which is precisely the kind of formulation that liberal cultural institutions like to use when they want to appear politically serious without becoming politically risky. But the works themselves pushed that frame much further. A participatory white wall allowed visitors to write what they wished. And what they wrote were, of course, anti-CAA slogans and expressions of NRC anxiety and fragments of political protest. None of this openly shouted revolution, and that is precisely why it mattered. To understand this, again, Bourdieu is indispensable. Cultural institutions do not merely display art, they organize symbolic capital. They confer legitimacy, determine seriousness, and classify which forms of speech are to be treated as aesthetic, political, or merely disruptive. The exhibition's works become dangerous because they unsettle the symbolic order the festival was designed to project. They permitted contested citizenship, protest, and administrative delay to appear inside the very space meant to display national confidence in all these. The technical glitch, as authorities claim, that later shut down the exhibition is therefore not a trivial detail. It is the institutional equivalent of a defensive reflex. The glitch affected precisely the works that touched CAA, the NRC, and the ongoing protests. This is not accidental, it is symptomatic. It marks the point at which the institution's rhetoric of openness collides with its inability to host political contradiction. Butler's notion of performativity sharpens this analysis further. Performativity teaches us that norms are not simply stated, they are reiterated through acts, citations, and repeated forms. The artists in this exhibition, they repeat the forms of festival art, video, caption, participatory wall, documentation, but they repeat them with a difference. That difference is again where that critique enters. They are outside the performance, they are inside of it. And they make that performance say more than what the institution thought that performance would say. And that is why, again, defiant compliance is the right concept here. The artists do not challenge the festival from the outside. They accept the invitation, inhabit the institution, and use its own forms to bring the crisis into view. So what then is the political significance of this exhibition? It is not simply that it addressed the CA or the NRC. More importantly, it demonstrated that the state-backed cultural sphere cannot fully separate itself from the crises of citizenship and protest that structure the world outside it.
Okay, so to conclude this, I want to say that what defiant compliance is that it is critique smuggled inside the very ceremony that was built to suppress it. The regime's own love for a spectacle needs to be seen as culturally legitimate and grand and worthy of great art. And that makes it impossible for them to recognize what is happening until it is already everywhere. The point is that you get the art in as as a Trojan horse. You don't storm the gates, but you let the power carry you in. Gwendolyn says that art defines what is imaginable. That is exactly why authoritarian regimes police it so obsessively. Because you control the art and you control the horizon. If you control what people can conceive of as possible, a world without an oppressor or a different future, these things have to be imagined before they can be real. So if you don't let people imagine them, they can never become real. Which is why she says, would humans dream of flying if birds did not exist? Defiant compliance works perfectly because it operates inside that horizon instead of outside it, while critiquing that very horizon. It doesn't announce itself and it doesn't give the regime a clean target. It lives inside that system, breathes its air, speaks its language, and it whispers something that's slightly different. That is why it endures, and that is why it matters. To end this, I would like to quote Ismato Gwendolyn's article, which is titled, "The job of the artist is to load the